A 6-year-old princess stumbles down a stone aisle, clutching toy wooden animals in her tiny hands. Beside her waits a 29-year-old king draped in gilded robes, his crown gleaming in the candlelight. Church bells roar across the medieval landscape. Crowds cheer from every corner. And with this single ceremony, a political bargain is sealed with a child's stolen future. How did England's Richard II come to wed a girl who still slept with her nanny at night? And what does this disturbing marriage reveal about the ruthless machinery of medieval power that crushed innocence beneath the weight of crowns and kingdoms? The year was 1396, and the 100 Years' War had bled both England and France to the bone. Truce after truce had collapsed like castles built on sand, leaving treasuries empty and battlefields littered with the dreams of dead kings. It was then that Richard II proposed what seemed like salvation to France's mad King Charles VI. A 30-year armistice, sweetened by the most precious currency medieval diplomacy knew, marriage to the French king's own daughter. Richard's advisers praised the match as binding 2 crowns with a silken thread. But the silk, of course, would be sewn directly through a child's life. The treaty clauses read like a merchant's ledger of human suffering, a dowry of 800,000 francs, promises of Calais neutrality, and a mutual defense pact that would reshape the map of Europe. Yet buried within these grand proclamations lay the most chilling detail of all. The diplomats had crafted their living guarantor with surgical precision. No consummation until the girl reached 12 years of age, they wrote, but her mere presence in England would force both kingdoms into compliance. Think about that for a moment. They were using a child's body as collateral for peace, her future as insurance against war. The ink was still wet on the parchment when servants began preparing Isabella's cradle for the journey across the Channel. A 6-year-old girl, torn from everything she knew, loaded onto a ship like cargo to seal the fate of nations. This wasn't diplomacy, this was sanctioned child trafficking, dressed in royal purple and blessed by holy men who should have known better. But who was this little girl, whose childhood would be sacrificed on the altar of international politics? Princess Isabella of Valois entered the world on November 9th, 1389, within the stone walls of the Louvre Palace. She was the 3rd surviving daughter of Charles VI and Isabeau of Bavaria, born into a lineage that traced back through centuries of French royalty. Yet for all her noble blood, Isabella was about to discover that royal children were merely pieces on a chessboard, controlled by men who had never known a mother's lullaby themselves. Her nursery told the story of a childhood that should have been filled with wonder. Tapestries depicting unicorns danced across the walls, while tutors gently coached her in nursery French, not the harsh language of diplomacy that would soon consume her life. She was a descendant of St. Louis IX, cousin to the powerful Valois dukes, yet her branch of the family tree was being pruned and shaped to serve as currency in a transaction she could never understand. Picture this innocent child pressing her face against cold palace windows, watching other children play in gardens she could never freely explore. Her world consisted of swaddled cloth dolls studded with pearls, while around her adults spoke in the calculating tongues of dowries and sovereignty. The contrast was heartbreaking. A little girl who still needed help tying her shoes was being discussed in council chambers as if she were a deed to property or a key to a treasure chest. The chronicler Jean Froissart would later describe her as a goodly little lady, but his words reveal the medieval world's devastating blindness to the concept of consent. She was good because she was quiet, little because she was powerless, and a lady because her suffering would be dressed in silk and called noble. Isabella of Valois was about to become the most tragic bride in European history, and she didn't even know what marriage meant. But what drove a grown man to seek marriage with a child barely old enough to walk steadily down cathedral steps? Richard II was a king drowning in the quicksand of his own ambitions, and he believed a French princess, however young, could pull him to safety. After the death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia, Richard found himself childless and increasingly isolated on a throne that felt more like a target than a seat of power. Baronial unrest simmered beneath the surface of English politics like a pot ready to boil over. Whispers of deposition followed Richard through the corridors of Westminster Palace, and rumors spread that the nobility was losing faith in a king who seemed more interested in art and pageantry than in the brutal business of medieval rulership. He needed heirs, he needed prestige, and most desperately, he needed allies who could serve as a buffer against his own rebellious English magnates. Richard's personality made this political calculation even more complex. He was a cultivated man who loved beauty, ceremony, and the theatrical displays of power that reinforced his belief in divine kingship. In his mind, a spectacular foreign bride would serve as living proof that God had chosen him to rule and that Europe's mightiest monarchy had blessed his reign with their most precious daughter. But here lies the grim irony that would define this entire tragic episode. To project strength, Richard was willing to publicly display his regime's complete dependence on a child. Every time little Isabella appeared at court, every ceremonial moment where she stood beside him in miniature robes served as a reminder that the King of England needed a 6-year-old girl to legitimize his crown. The man who claimed to rule by divine right was about to anchor his entire political future to someone who still needed help cutting her meat at dinner. This wasn't strength. It was desperation, dressed in ermine and gold. The men who orchestrated this grotesque transaction worked with the cold efficiency of merchants trading in human flesh. The chief architects included French Marshal Boucicaut, a seasoned diplomat who had learned to speak of children as if they were livestock, and the English Earl of Nottingham, whose calculating mind saw opportunity in every tear that would fall from Isabella's eyes. Papal legates smoothed the canonical hurdles with the practiced ease of men who had spent careers finding religious justifications for the unjustifiable. The most disturbing document in this entire affair was the papal dispensation that excused the massive age disparity under what they called urgent necessity of peace. Think about those words. Urgent necessity of peace. The Church, which claimed to protect the innocent, had literally written permission for a grown man to marry a child because it might prevent a war. They had weighed a little girl's childhood against political stability and decided her sacrifice was acceptable collateral damage. The language used around the bargaining table reveals everything we need to know about how these powerful men viewed Isabella. She wasn't discussed as a person with thoughts, feelings, or rights. Instead, the diplomatic correspondence refers to her as cargo to be transported, treaty weight to be measured, and future issue to be produced. They spoke of her body as if it were a ship carrying precious goods, her womb as if it were a field waiting to be planted with the seeds of dynastic succession. Behind the scenes, factional intrigue made the situation even more sinister. Burgundian and Armagnac courts jockeyed for position over who would have the honor of escorting the tiny bride to her doom, each faction seeing an opportunity to curry favor with both French and English crowns. The competition wasn't about protecting Isabella, it was about who could profit most from her misery. When the arrangements were finalized, Isabella departed France, escorted by 300 knights in gleaming armor. Yet for all their martial splendor, she remained utterly powerless among them, a small figure lost in a sea of men who had traded away her future before she was old enough to understand what a future even meant. October 31st, 1396. Gray Channel winds whipped the banners of two kingdoms as history's most disturbing wedding ceremony prepared to unfold in the stone chapel of St. Nicholas at Calais. The very air seemed to protest what was about to happen, as if nature itself recoiled from the spectacle of a child being sacrificed on the altar of political ambition. Isabella's wedding gown told its own tragic story. Silver velvet had been stiffened with wire and padding so the dress wouldn't drag on the ground behind her tiny frame. The hem was studded with 339 pearls, each one representing a small fortune, yet none as precious as the childhood being stripped away from the girl who wore them. Her veil, meant to symbolize purity and anticipation, instead became a shroud covering the death of innocence. The ritual itself was a masterpiece of medieval hypocrisy. When the priest asked the traditional questions of consent, Isabella's voice was too small, too frightened to carry across the chapel. Her uncle answered for her because she literally could not speak for herself. And nobody in that sacred space saw the horror in this arrangement. The French lords in attendance wept tears they claimed were for joy, while English courtiers cheered for an alliance that would bring peace to their war-torn lands. Not a single person questioned why the bride remained silent throughout her own wedding ceremony. Richard placed a ring on Isabella's finger, a golden band set with a ruby the size of her milk tooth. The symbolism was accidentally perfect, a blood-red stone to mark the beginning of a relationship that would drain the life from everyone it touched. During the wedding feast that followed, servants offered the new couple swan prepared in saffron and candied violets fit for royalty. Isabella could barely chew the sugared almonds placed before her, her jaw still too small for the adult delicacies of her new station. The procession to Dover that followed became a parade of willful blindness. Crowds lined the roads to adore the spectacle, cheering for a fairy tale princess and her king. But their ignorance couldn't mask the exploitation marching before their eyes. A little girl, who should have been playing with dolls, was instead being displayed like a trophy, her childhood sacrificed to feed the appetite of kingdoms hungry for peace at any price. Once the pageantry faded and the wedding guests returned to their own lands, Isabella found herself trapped in a gilded cage at Sheen Palace. The English court had prepared a nursery wing specifically for their child queen, complete with French ladies-in-waiting who spoke her native tongue but could do nothing to ease the homesickness that gnawed at her small heart like a persistent fever. Her daily routine became a carefully orchestrated performance of childhood interrupted. Mornings brought lessons in English pronunciation, her tiny tongue struggling to wrap around the harsh consonants of a language that would never feel like home. Afternoons were devoted to embroidery, teaching her small fingers to create the delicate stitches that royal wives were expected to master. But the most haunting part of her schedule came during the allotted hours when she was required to curtsy to her husband in formal court settings. Richard, to his credit, seemed to recognize the absurdity of the situation. He reportedly treated Isabella with gentleness, gifting her miniature gold hounds that she could hold in her palm, and commissioning doll-houses furnished with furniture small enough for her fingers to arrange. Yet even these tender gestures couldn't disguise the fact that politics, not affection, dictated every interaction between them. Their relationship existed at the pleasure of treaties and trade agreements, not because of any natural bond between human beings. Court gossip swirled around the unlikely pair like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. Some nobles openly mocked the union, whispering jokes about the king who needed a nursemaid to help his wife reach the dinner table. Others feared the growing French influence at court, viewing Isabella's very presence as a threat to English independence. She became a lightning rod for xenophobia, blamed for problems she was too young to understand and criticized for homesickness she was too small to hide. In the quiet moments between ceremonies and state functions, Isabella could be found pressing flowers between the pages of her prayer book, creating small beauty in a world that had grown too large and cold around her. She remained blissfully unaware that her name had become the cornerstone of a geopolitical ceasefire, that her tiny signature on documents she couldn't read was holding back the dogs of war across 2 continents. The summer of 1399 brought winds of change that would shatter Isabella's already fragile world like glass against stone. Henry Bolingbroke landed at Ravenspur with an army of ambitious men who smelled weakness on the throne, while Richard campaigned uselessly in Ireland, blind to the betrayal brewing in his own kingdom. When the king finally returned, he found his crown had already been stolen by those he had trusted most. By September, Richard found himself imprisoned in the cold stone chambers of Pontefract Castle, his divine right to rule reduced to nothing more than bitter memory. On September 30th, 1399, Parliament formally deposed him, ending his reign with the stroke of a pen and the weight of political necessity. Isabella, now 10 years old and still more child than queen, was placed under guard at Wallingford Castle while powerful men debated her fate as if she were a piece of property left behind by a bankrupt merchant. The new king, Henry IV, saw opportunity in the girl's misfortune. He offered to marry Isabella to his own son, the future Henry V, believing he could keep the French alliance alive by simply transferring the child bride to a different English prince. But France, perhaps finally awakening to the horror of what they had done, refused to allow their daughter to be passed from one English king to another like a family heirloom. In January of 1400, the final act of this tragedy played out in the darkness of a Yorkshire winter. Richard died at Pontefract Castle, likely starved to death by men who had once knelt before his throne. The child widow, barely old enough to understand what death meant, found herself grieving for a man she had scarcely known, but who had defined her entire existence for 4 years. The exchange that followed in 1401 became the bitter epilogue to a marriage that should never have been. Isabella was escorted to the French border under heavy guard, carrying with her the few possessions that remained from her English captivity. Chroniclers noted with unconscious irony that she took back dolls and toys instead of royal charters, a child reclaiming her childhood treasures while abandoning the crown that had stolen her innocence. She crossed back into France not as a returning queen, but as a little girl who had survived something that had no name in any language. Freedom from her English captivity did not mean freedom from the machinery of dynastic politics that had already consumed 5 years of Isabella's short life. In 1406, at the age of 16, she found herself once again walking down a church aisle, this time to marry Charles, Duke of Orleans, in yet another calculated political alliance. The difference was cruel in its simplicity. She was finally old enough to understand what was happening to her. This second marriage offered Isabella something her first never could, the companionship of shared youth. Charles was close to her own age, a poet who filled their chambers with courtly songs and verses that spoke of love rather than treaties. For a brief, shining moment, Isabella experienced what marriage could be when it wasn't built on the foundation of a child's stolen consent. They shared laughter, music, and the simple pleasure of two young people discovering intimacy at an age when their bodies and hearts were ready for such discoveries. But the happiness that had been denied to Isabella as a child bride was not destined to last into her adulthood. In 1409, at just 19 years old, she died in childbirth at the Château de Blois, her body finally succumbing to the demands that had been placed upon it since she was 6. The child she died bringing into the world perished as well, as if the trauma of her early marriage had poisoned even her ability to create new life. She was buried in Notre-Dame de Paris, her tomb marking the end of a life that had been spent almost entirely in service to the ambitions of men. Isabella's death sent ripples across the diplomatic landscape of medieval Europe. The temporary peace her marriage had secured began to crumble like parchment exposed to flame. Anglo-French relations, which had been held together by the silk thread of her presence, snapped completely. The 100 Years' War resumed with renewed fury, as if her death had released all the violence her marriage had temporarily contained. The question that haunts historians to this day cuts to the heart of medieval political morality. Did the diplomacy gained from Isabella's sacrifice justify the human cost extracted from one girl's lost childhood? The brief peace her marriage secured lasted barely longer than her life, while the trauma of her experience echoed through generations of royal women who would face similar fates. 10 years of upheaval triggered by one ceremonial pledge, a decade of war, deposition, death, and diplomatic collapse, all set in motion by the moment a 6-year-old girl was forced to say vows she couldn't understand to a man old enough to be her father. The marriage of Richard II and Isabella of Valois reveals the most disturbing truth about medieval power, its ability to redefine the most heinous exploitation as the highest virtue. The chroniclers who recorded these events were complicit in this redefinition, their flowery language serving to disguise child abuse as romantic diplomacy. They praised the spectacle while ignoring the suffering, celebrating the pageantry while turning blind eyes to the tears of a homesick little girl who missed her nursery in France. Their words became weapons used to normalize the abnormal, to make the unthinkable seem not only acceptable but admirable. This wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern that infected medieval Europe like a plague. The Habsburg courts, the kingdoms of Aragon, the Burgundian duchies, all practiced similar alliances, trading children like livestock at market fairs. Each transaction was blessed by holy men, celebrated by poets, and recorded by historians as evidence of diplomatic brilliance rather than systematic abuse. The machinery of dynastic power had completely warped the concepts that should have protected the innocent. Consent became meaningless when children could be married before they learned to read. Childhood became expendable when kingdoms needed heirs and alliances. Bodily autonomy disappeared entirely when young girls' wombs were viewed as territorial assets to be claimed by foreign crowns. But perhaps the most haunting image from this entire dark chapter isn't found in the grand ceremonies or political maneuvering. It's the sound of wedding bells ringing across the medieval landscape, their bronze voices proclaiming a peace that would prove as fragile as the child who secured it. Those bells secured a fragile truce between warring nations, but they rang loudest and longest in the ears of one small girl who would carry their echo to her grave. In the end, the most disturbing royal marriage in history reminds us that power without conscience is simply cruelty dressed in silk and blessed by those who should have known better.